World leaders gather in Thailand for the 29th APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. What's at the top of the agenda? Hello, I'm Arnold Schneider, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke Friday at the first in-person APEC meeting in 4 years. He expressed the need for peace and stability and a shared future within the Asia-Pacific community. This year's theme, Open, Connect and Balance, looks to sustainability and a green recovery as the global economy rebuilds from the COVID-19 pandemic. Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden are not at the meeting. CGTN's Zhao Yunfei has this report from Bangkok.
APEC economic leaders have vowed to pursue the vitalization of the economy. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech at this year's APEC Leaders Meeting in Bangkok. He stressed the importance of maintaining international fairness and justice, staying committed to openness and inclusiveness, and striving for green and low-carbon development. It all comes to a peaceful and prosperous regional development. China has been maintaining close ties with its neighbors. The country is acting on the principles of amity, sincerity, mutual trust, and inclusiveness with its neighbors. China is committed to its policy of opening to the outside world. It strives to create new opportunities to the world and to contribute its share for an open economy. President Xi says China will advance a border agenda of opening up across more areas and in greater depth, follow the Chinese path to modernization, and put in place new systems for a higher standard open economy. APEC was China's first regional economic cooperation organization that it joined. In 2020, China's trade volume with APEC economies reached $2.87 trillion, accounting for 62% of its total foreign trade. APEC member economies comprise 38% of the world's population and 60% of the world's GDP. While the world faces challenges with virus mutations and soaring inflation, the APEC region's economic growth has been steady. That's why the leaders have vowed to create a more resilient cooperation under the framework. President Xi says the Asia-Pacific is the powerhouse of global economic growth. Over the past decades, robust economic cooperation in the region has created the Asia-Pacific miracle. As the world has come to another historical crossroads, the Asia-Pacific plays an even more important and prominent role. The Asia-Pacific is a dynamic region that shows strong potential in the post-pandemic recovery. China says it will continue to make efforts to boost Asia-Pacific economy and pursue a shared future for mankind. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Bangkok.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Virginia, Arthur Dong is a teaching professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. From Boston, we are joined by Ambassador Jorge Heine. He is the former Chilean ambassador to China. From Manila, Richard Heydarian is a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines Asian Center. And from Hong Kong, we're joined by Edward Say. He is the founder and CEO of the Gaofeng Advisory Company. Welcome to all of you to the show. Edward Say, let me start with you in Hong Kong. This is President Xi Jinping's first visit to Thailand as president. And during the visit, he said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "Today the world has come to another historical crossroads, and this has made the Asia-Pacific region even more important and prominent in its standing and in its role." Now, as the world is trying to escape from recession and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, how important is this region to that effort?
It's incredibly important. Just over the last couple of weeks, we have had a number of major meetings in Asia. Number one being the ASEAN meeting. Second was the G20, was Jakarta just not too long ago. In Bali not too long ago. And also now with the APEC in Bangkok. It's really critical that Asia remains a major area of stability on the global economic conditions. And we see from the numbers that, just was shown by your colleagues, that, the trade in between Asian region as well as between Asia and the rest of the world has become very dominant. So this is the right time, in fact, to have this sort of meetings to really recalibrate the increasingly importance of Asia to the rest of the world.
And Edward, if we look at China by itself, how big is China's role in driving growth, not just in the region, but across the globe?
Incredibly important. China is the largest trading nation with many, many countries in the world. And China continues to have a reasonable growth despite the pandemic and also the global uncertainties and so on. And China is the biggest trading nation with Asia Pacific in general. So China's role in driving the economic recovery for the rest of the world, including for Asia, is critical.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, while President Xi was in Thailand, he held a number of one-on-one meetings, bilateral meetings. Among them, he met the leaders of New Zealand, he met the leaders of Philippines, and this one would be of interest to you. He met the leader of Chile. He also met the King of Thailand. What is the significance of these one-on-one meetings, especially the one that he held with the Chilean leader?
Well, extremely significant. This is the first time President Boric met President Xi. As you know, for Chile, China is its #1 trading partner by far. That trade between Chile and China reached $55 billion in 2021, up from $8 billion in 2005 when we signed the free trade agreement. In recent years, China has also become, on some cases in 2019 and 2021, the single biggest source of foreign direct investment into Chile. And something similar can be said about many other countries in South America, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Uruguay, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that China is extremely important for South America as a whole. And let me emphasize the following. Chile took the lead in Latin America in strengthening ties with APEC. It joined APEC as far back as 1994 and pursued a strategy of what I've called Asianization, globalization as Asianization, meaning we realized very early on that the Asia Pacific was the region that was the most dynamic, the fastest growing, and it was very important for us to link up with Asia. So today, 60% of Chile's exports go to Asia, 38% of our exports go to China. So Chile is what it is today, in many ways the most developed country in Latin America because of that strategy. In that sense, the Chilean government attaches great significance to APEC because APEC has been one of the driving forces for more cross-Pacific trade. And it is important to keep that momentum. You mentioned earlier this is the first time the leaders meet in person in 4 years. And this may be the opportunity in which this momentum for free trade, for open regionalism, for regional integration can be kept.
And Ambassador, you have served as Chile's ambassador to China, so you will be familiar with the country. What do you make of China's influence in the region?
Well, I will say this. The reason the Asia Pacific has become such a significant driving force of the world economy, among other things, obviously not the only one, but a very important factor there has been the role of China, which is by now the second largest economy in the world. Let me emphasize the following. What I think is extremely important is the fact that from very early on, China championed free trade in the Pacific Basin. I remember I was in Beijing in 2014 when China insisted at the APEC meeting that was held then in Beijing that the APEC countries give the go-ahead to a study, a feasibility study of the FTAAP, the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. There had been some resistance to that among a number of countries, but it was finally, that study was done. It was submitted in Lima, Peru in 2016 to the member countries. So the point I'm trying to make is that China has been important in the Asia Pacific, not just because of sheer size, but also because of its commitment to free trade. And at a time when free trade is being questioned in some parts of the world, I think it's important to hold the flag of free trade up. We believe in Chile, in South America, that free trade is a key tool to foster development and to bring progress to our countries. And it is important to keep the commitment to free trade up.
Arthur Dong, as Edward Say told us a moment ago, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity in the region over the recent week. We had the G20 and now, of course, we have APEC. We see a lot in the world is changing. There are new challenges. There are shifting alliances as well. Now, attending the APEC meeting in Thailand are two countries which are not members of APEC. That's France and Saudi Arabia. What does that tell us? Why France and Saudi Arabia?
It tells you a lot because these two nations place a great deal of significance in terms of the developments of this region. And as pointed out correctly by my colleagues here on this show, there's a lot at stake. Considering where we came from over the past several years with the result of the global pandemic and where we are today, all these member nations at APEC are starting to look forward to what the future may look like. And given the multitude of challenges that we're all facing, whether it's the war in Ukraine, rising inflation across the board all over the world, as well as the growing awareness that geopolitical tensions are creating economic ripples across the world. These things have to be addressed, and APEC certainly serves as a very important forum to gather all of the world's leaders in an intimate setting to try to set the stage and the agenda to reverse the trajectory and the downward trajectory that we all seem to be headed towards, and perhaps to try to open up a dialogue that will lead us into a better future.
Richard Heydarian, as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the show, these 21 member countries account for 60% of the world's total GDP, gross domestic production, and about half of world's trade. And according to the APEC Economic Policy Report for 2022, the group faces two major challenges, and those are, one, to repair the economic damage which was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and two, to respond to climate change and the other environmental changes. Can you give us a sense of how big these challenges are and how well positioned are the members of APEC to tackle them?
Right. I mean, as far as the Indo-Pacific countries or APEC members are concerned, I think there's a recognition that we're facing what, historians like Adam Tooze call as a polycrisis. Historically, when we had concerns about a crisis, we would look at a center of gravity, right? A single center of gravity. But what we're facing right now are potentially multiple centers of crisis. The threat of recession in the United States, the more credible threat of recession in the European Union zone, and then, of course, in China, you had the economic slowdown in recent years. So I think there's this recognition that if we don't come together, despite our geopolitical differences, we're all going to face a very difficult condition. So as much as we want to have economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, we're also facing storms, multiple storms just over the horizon. And that is why if you look at the speech by President Xi Jinping at the APEC, he essentially reiterated what was achieved during the Bali Détente, when he met President Biden. I mean, the idea there is this: we cannot afford to have a kind of a destructive geopolitical showdown at this point in time, in as much as some sort of strategic competition is inevitable. And that's precisely because the only way to deal with the economic challenges, geopolitical challenges over the horizon is if we have a working relationship. So I think that kind of pragmatism was very important, especially coming from President Xi Jinping, who just secured a historic third term as the president of China and is now unquestionably the paramount leader of China. Now, of course, there's also the aspect of the climate change. If you look at multiple surveys, whether by HSBC, by think tanks based in Europe, it's very clear that Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific countries are very prominent among the top 10 most vulnerable countries. We're looking at countries like Pakistan, Philippines, Indonesia, southern and coastal regions of China. So this is also a region of not only extreme economic dynamism, but also extreme vulnerability to climate change. Hence the emphasis by many countries, including the Philippines, on the need for robust infrastructure, critical infrastructure, green infrastructure. And of course, China's Belt and Road Initiative is one big step in the right direction if we can focus on green infrastructure development. That's why President Xi Jinping was, of course, very much anticipated as far as his speech and his bilateral meetings were concerned.
Richard, I'd like your opinion on something else. I mean, you talked about competition. Competition, yes, great, but they don't want to see a return to any kind of Cold War or any kind of rivalry. And one of the things we have heard in recent days is that countries in the region do not want to be put in the position of having to take sides, of choosing one over the other.
Yeah, I mean, this is very prominent in Southeast Asia, no? Where there is clearly the struggle for autonomy because of our colonial experience, because of the Cold War experience. You know, the Indochina wars were horrible, and the effect and trauma has been lingering up until today. But the problem is that not making choice is a choice in itself. And my contention is that over time that could turn into a luxury for many countries around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, where I come from. Just the other day, there was a major summit in Singapore when Foreign Minister Balakrishnan called for a new non-aligned movement that protects smaller countries in this part of the world from the effects of economic showdown between the United States and China. In particular, of course, the big worry for us in Asia, in Southeast Asia, are America's sanctions against the critical sectors and cutting-edge industry in China, including chip-making capabilities of China. The problem is that because China is so important to the rest of the region, any sanctions against China will have ripple effects. And many countries in the region who also have good relationship with the United States feel that it's unfair that they have to also bear the burden of the showdown between the two superpowers. So APEC is important because it deals with economics, right? And because it deals with economics, I think there's a hope that there'll be an understanding between the major powers, and this downward spiral of sanctions and counter-sanctions will not drag everyone into an economic whirlpool, if not the geopolitical whirlpool that we're also worrying about.
Ambassador Heine, if we look at this...
Can I add something to that?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Yes. Now, let me say the following. It seems to me it has a deep symbolic significance that the meeting of the G20 took place in Indonesia, where the Bandung Conference in 1955, which was to give rise later to the non-aligned movement, took place. And yes, the foreign minister of Singapore has expressed an interest in a revival of the non-aligned movement on economic issues. The president of Indonesia has referred to non-alignment. He was pressured, for example, not to invite Russia into the G20 meeting, and he refused to do that. So I think we are seeing effectively a revival of non-alignment in this year of 2022. And as you know, with my colleagues, Ominami and Fortin, we have put forth a thesis of what we call active non-alignment for Latin America, that this is the moment we ought to take a stance on, put our own interests front and center, and not choose between the two superpowers. And it seems to me that is a position that has been gaining much traction in the course of this year.
Arthur Dong, we are living right now in a very uncertain global economic climate. In fact, the World Bank has warned that the global economy is dangerously close to a recession. We see inflation remains elevated. Interest rates are rising, and we see a growing debt burden, especially on developing countries. In fact, the World Bank itself has lowered the growth forecast, global growth forecast, from 3% to 1.9%. Looking at these challenges, I mean, there needs to be really close cooperation between all these countries to overcome them, doesn't there?
Absolutely. The challenges and the shocks that the world is facing on the things that you have just mentioned, be they inflation, be they rising interest rates and cost of capital, be they food insecurity, as well as spikes in energy prices. These things have, in a sense, affected APEC member nations disproportionately when it comes to the actual impact on those that reside in these countries. And so there are many challenges that all these leaders are facing, and it's going to require a global, a multilateral effort to try to sort of make policy adjustments in a thoughtful manner to try to avert, the sort of destructive impact that these economic challenges are imposing on all of these member nations.
Richard Heydarian, the United States, of course, this past summer was key to the formation of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now, President Biden is not at the APEC meeting. What does his absence tell us about United States priorities, or how it views APEC? Or to put it another way, is U.S. influence waning?
Right. Well, I mean, Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, is attending in behalf of Biden, who has had a family commitment. Well, honestly, we know that the Thai were very unhappy with Biden not attending, because I think they had to even adjust the event by a day or so to accommodate Biden. But Biden, felt that, well, he attended already ASEAN and the G20 summits in Southeast Asia. Perhaps Kamala can take care of it. And Kamala Harris actually will be visiting, well, also in addition to Bangkok, also Manila in the coming days to also fortify that very crucial alliance. So as far as the U.S. is concerned, it's not like they're ignoring the region or neglecting the region in the ways that we saw under the Bush administration or the Trump administration. Nevertheless, the biggest challenge for the United States is, of course, its economic footprint in the region. Yes, historically, the U.S. has been important to this part of the world, but in terms of new economic pledges, it's not offering anything significant compared to China. And if you look at it, last year we were talking about a kind of a U.S.-led Asian digital free trade kind of pact. Now we're talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but let's just be honest about it. So far, these are pronouncements, more symbolic pronouncements than substantive proposals by the United States. And of course, the United States has a major disadvantage compared to China. You know, Biden is not in a position to corral or to tell American companies to invest in country X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's quite different in countries perhaps in Japan, like Japan, or definitely in China. And more than that, I mean, if you look at it, I think the best chance really for the United States to have economic influence in this part of the world is to work with like-minded powers like Japan or India or South Korea, which already have significant and growing investment footprint here. But so far we're not seeing any significant push in that direction. It's also because there are political constraints. Within the Biden administration, we know that there were much more protectionist, America first kind of mindset, which is carried over from the Trump administration. In the US Congress, we know that even Democratic Party is not on board in terms of free trade area. Even a digital free trade seems to be difficult for the Biden administration. So clearly, yes, the US has to do something on the economic front. And that's why I said the best chance for the United States is not to compete head-to-head against China, but to work with other allies who actually have the capability to make investments or already have made investments, like Japan, which is a very big infrastructure player in this part of the world. So this is the reality for the United States. It cannot head-on-head compete with China economically.
Edward, say China is looking to join the CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. How important are these groups for the effort to move towards free trade in the region?
It's very important. China already is a member and a very important member of RCEP, which will be very important for the region already. But in addition to that, if China can enter into these other regional agreements, it's going to foster more regional trade. And in general, trade is good for everybody. And I think the theme so far that we have heard from President Xi is about collaboration, inclusiveness, more trade, more working together. And through this kind of trading mechanisms on a regional basis, China could play an even bigger role. This is critical not only for the economic recovery, but also to define the right paradigm for the rest of the world or for the world going forward. I think this antagonistic view from some of the Western countries on how to look at its relationship with other countries in the world and try to divide and conquer have shown a lot of problems. A lot of countries, as we have just heard from other colleagues already, a lot of countries in the region, in Asia Pacific in particular, didn't really find a lot of value from that kind of approach. Whereas a more inclusive, a more collaborative, and more economically oriented approach would make much more sense. So if China could enter into CPTPP as well as the digital agreement, that would be even better for not only China, but also for the region.
Ambassador Heine, what are your thoughts on the future of free trade in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, it seems to me one way to look at it is to look at various building blocks. As my fellow panelists have mentioned, we now have the RCEP, which is extremely significant, in some ways the biggest international trade agreement in the world. We have the CPTPP, of which Chile is a member, and also the DEPA, the Digital Economic Partnership, which Chile was one of the founding members. So if we add to that what APEC can do in terms of pushing for the FTAP, which has been, something that's been quite for a long time in the books, there's been some resistance to it. But in the end, the movement proves itself by actually moving. So it seems to me it is important for APEC not to give up on its open regionalism, free trade, economic integration agenda. That is the way to keep the Asia Pacific as being the most dynamic and fastest growing region in the world. So I am, mildly hopeful, mildly optimistic about this meeting of APEC, the first in person in 4 years. And hopefully it will give the impetus to trans-Pacific trade that is so badly needed.
Arthur Dong, the next APEC meeting will be held in the United States. It will be hosted by the United States. And I'm wondering, to what extent has that been complicated by the fact that President Biden is not at the current APEC meeting? In fact, the man who heads the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Aaron Connolly, said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "If this is a meeting that President Biden could afford to miss in 2022, then how important is it for other leaders to show up at APEC in 2023? Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I mean, certainly from an optics point of view, the lack of presence on behalf of the United States and the chief executive certainly, casts some doubt in terms of, U.S. commitment towards this region. But hopefully, as this meeting next shifts to the United States, we'll start to see some correction in policies. And already, based on the momentum that was built by the G20 meeting, I'm optimistic, or at least reservedly optimistic, that at least we are starting to arrest the trajectory, the downward trajectory in terms of trade nationalism, and maybe taking a more open view towards the restoration of free trade.
And Arthur, just one other point, and I've only got 20 seconds for this. Do you see by next year, this time when the APEC meeting's held, that countries around the world would have had some kind of a grip on runaway inflation, as well as the other crises that we are seeing right now, like an energy crisis?
Yes, given the sort of policies that have been enacted here on the fiscal policy side, the spike in interest rates, that's going to have an impact, and we're already starting to see the impact here in the United States in terms of the reduction, both at the consumer level of inflation, and certainly with regard to some of these key indicators, we're starting to see that take effect. These interest rate reductions take time to work its way through the economy.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.